Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a look at evolving insider risk programs. My name is Joshua Massey. I'm the Director of Enterprise Risk at the MITRE Corporation, where I've also been the Insider Threat Program Senior Official for the last 8 years. Today, we're going to explore how insider risk programs have continued to evolve naturally over the past 20 years. How these programs have grown exponentially beyond just the traditional lens of trying to identify spies into more of a full spectrum of insider-related risks, including data exfiltration. We'll explore how we hope to shift from a reactive to proactive culture to enable our organizations to move left of the threats, and assess how this includes adopting new technologies, processes, procedures, bringing in more stakeholders, and tackling more problem sets. I'll be joined today by my two esteemed colleagues, Mark Burns and Eric Ewald. Mark, would you please start off by introducing yourself, and then Eric as well?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Burns. I am the Chief of Assessments and Professionalization at the Defense Insider Threat Management and Analysis Center, or DITMAC, and I've been there since its inception in December of 2014.
Awesome. So I'm Eric Ewald. I'm a senior associate within our commercial cyber technology solutions practice at Booz Allen Hamilton. I specialize in insider risk program evaluations, design, and ultimately operating the subsequent programs.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark and Eric. We're going to jump right in. We've got a packed agenda and want to share hopefully a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So we're going to jump right in with the topic of naming of our programs. It seems even the term insider threat is being modified across the landscape, with organizations considering choosing alternatives such as insider risk or counter insider threat programs, even insider trust, to demonstrate an evolution of how insider threat is viewed and addressed. How should organizations think about what they call their programs, particularly with an eye of communicating to their employees and stakeholders? Why is getting the name so important?
Mark, you or me?
I'll go first. Thanks. I think getting the name right is important. Everyone in every organization represents a certain amount of risk. So therefore, everyone is an insider risk, but clearly not everyone is an insider threat. And last year, one organization I'm aware of, the Government Accountability Office, changed their name to the CARE program to avoid the stigma in their organization of the term insider threat. And CARE stands for Collaboration, Assessment, Resolution, and Education. And since they've changed their name, they have seen a 50% increase in reporting of concerning behavior, which has allowed them to mitigate the issues before they became serious incidents.
No, that's a great point. I actually had an exchange earlier today with one of our VPs about whether to, in a presentation deck, proposal deck, to talk about insider risk mitigation or insider trust and safety. Again, I think what we're seeing in industry is that it depends on where that program geographically lives. I think historically, and at least in my personal experience, programs in Europe don't tend to really enjoy insider threat as a term. I think you have great difficulty getting that across the finish line organizationally. So in those cases, I think we're seeing insider risk mitigation, countermeasures and threat assessments, different types of things. But it absolutely is a critical part of program development, because again, you can say a lot with a name and you don't want to roll out a program with the wrong name, because you can say too many things or say too much that's going to be held in a negative light, right? You don't want to start off on the wrong foot. So, yeah.
I think those, go ahead.
I was going to add also that Google didn't disappoint me. And when I searched insider threat program name, I actually came across an insider threat program name generator that someone had created that listed, must have put into it a lot of words and vocabulary, and came up with over 5,000 permutations of the name for an insider threat program. And a couple of them I thought were pretty good. Internal Trust Management, Insider Risk Mitigation Center, Enterprise Prevention Team, intellectual property trust group, integrity risk office, a lot of names, and branding is important, but I also think success in the end state needs to be defined by a culture change where employees feel that a program is there to protect not only them, but even the people who are demonstrating the risk. Programs need to work so people feel that when they report something, they're not turning people in when in fact they could be helping to turn people around.
No, I appreciate that point, Mark. And I think you both hit, the nail right on the head that this is not just a marketing and branding gimmick. It really is about understanding that words have meaning, and we want to communicate our programs effectively in a way that they're clearly understood and are connected with our corporations, our culture, our people. And I think you both really, address that and in your comments. So thank you. Insider risk programs are looking to automate and adopt new technologies and capabilities, hopefully with the goal of making our ability to process large amounts of information and data much more efficient, while also freeing up our personnel to conduct more proactive analysis using a more risk-based approach. How do we make our data work for us and make sense of it all to make the most timely and accurate decisions on the highest risk matters?
So I can take that one. I think the easiest way for us to get more out of our data is to more effectively understand what we're trying to get out of the analysis itself, right? And that goes to program scoping. One thing that we see in industry is heavily leaning towards analytics very early in the program lifecycle, where within how we design programs within Booz Allen is ultimately pushing to stakeholder engagement first, and then kind of letting the analytics follow. I'm not sure if that's something that actually happens in the kind of government space, but kind of curious to hear if Mark has any additional feedback on that.
No, it's a similar challenge in any kind of organization. I think within the government, particularly within the Department of Defense, where we have 47 different components that all have different missions, different cultures, different, obviously different size. We look at an insider threat program of, somewhere between 8 and 11 million. And when your margin of error is plus or minus a million people, it just kind of identifies the scoping challenge. And I think a common mistake is often looking at the data first. And when you start with the question, what are you trying to answer, then you can then look for the data that would best help you answer that question. I've always felt 100% that an insider threat program is a people problem. Therefore, the answer is going to come from people, not necessarily from a data set. But knowing what you're trying to answer helps you then look for the data to answer that question. And sometimes it's information that's available to the component, it's organic to them, and oftentimes they are looking for some external data when they have it in front of them. And that's, the analogy, you're looking for a needle in a haystack. You don't want to make the haystack too big to start looking for it.
Yeah, one of the topics we discuss frequently with our key, senior executives and stakeholders is that idea of we're looking for needles in the haystack, and we want to reduce the haystack to become much more effective at finding those needles. Obviously, we're working with large data sets. Curious what each of your perspectives are. Do you see the role, particularly of data scientists, growing within the realm and within these programs? Have you worked with data scientists in the past, and is that an effective tool towards your programs?
So I think, again, it depends on the program. It depends on where the program lives, and it depends on that program scope. Size and magnitude of the information is going to lend itself better to like your data science realm, somebody that can tackle those very large data sets, billions and billions of lines of data. But do I see a data scientist ultimately as like an integral element of that team? Not necessarily. I think that's something that you could get to, or the program should, if you're focusing heavily on analytics, right? You might get there in the kind of program maturity lifecycle, but not right out of the gate. You have to have people with that I think, a fundamental technical understanding of information, data structures, and how to access that information to then provide the benefit, right? And in this case, it's detecting things that are of concern for the organization.
And I agree with that for most organizations. The challenge becomes for us in the Department of Defense when it scales to the size. So data scientists do play a critical role in all facets of the data lifecycle. So being able to prepare external data, upload it into tools, and vice versa, help write algorithms for advanced analytics. We have data scientists at the DITMAC, and I think because of the scale and size, it's important. They help us create visualizations of the data so that it can be easily digested and understood by the audience. But the key point for us, and I think almost all programs, is behavioral scientists help data scientists identify the data that quantifies human behavior. Again, it's a people sport, so can't have one without the other, and that balance is critical.
Yeah, that's great. I think both of those answers collectively, what I take away from that is the data science, the behavior science is critically important, but don't be afraid just because you don't have those elements available today that you can't get started. Understanding those elements, ensuring that your programs are structured and moving forward, and then as you evolve and mature, those should be questions maybe you revisit time to time to figure out how to continue to evolve and mature your programs.
Good point.
Speaking of maturity, as we mature our programs and moving away from just, sheer number of cases to identifying, true measures of success through understanding our progression of organizational policies, our training, our outreach, and our awareness efforts. Can you kind of talk through kind of the evolutions of measures of performance or measures of effectiveness that you've seen work for you? What should we be looking at? What are the one or two key successes you have found for defining and measuring success?
I'll start on this one, Eric, because it is incredibly hard, if not impossible, to estimate or prove a counterfactual. How do you estimate the value of a disaster that was prevented? And like many, I'm not good at figuring out what might have happened had I not come to work today. But I believe we need to focus on effectiveness and efficiency. And those two also are a very delicate balance. The main goals of an insider threat program should be to deter, detect, and mitigate. So what actions does the program need to address for each of those? For detect, user activity monitoring, continuous vetting alerts, workforce reporting. You can track all of those type things. And for deter, you have training, awareness programs, threat management, outreach. You can track each of those. Mitigate, generally comes down to referring to somebody who's going to take something for action. We have a behavioral threat analysis center as part of the DITMAC consultation. So we can track each of those, but in the DoD components itself, they can track, program policies, procedures. Are they meeting their targets, timelines for detecting, deterring, and timelines for the outcome? And that's what's important, outcome data. Did any of the actions taken that took place, was it a direct result of one of the referrals, whether it's an adjudication or decision? So I think there's a lot of things that any component can track if they're looking at it from an aspect of what are they trying to do.
Yeah, and I think there's a natural progression in the metrics that you track at the beginning, very early on in that program lifecycle. If I'm just spinning things up, right, it's binary. Like, am I able to respond confidently? Do I have cross-functional response enabled, right? And then from there, it's like, who do I need for cross-functional response? And those are granular things that we're tracking that ultimately at the beginning, that drives accountability and helps us really understand where we need to go. But as far as, I'm trying to think big picture types of effectiveness metrics, I think expanding scope or tracking your scope and coverage of the program is important, right? If you are focusing on a microcosm of the organization, so if I think of like cleared work versus non-cleared work, right? That might be, you might have an insider program that dedicates itself solely to that. But in the big picture of, insider risk management, we want to be able to effectively gauge that risk at a macro level. And I think things like program scope, coverage, data sources, if you're waiting on them, and they could be critical, are all super relevant metrics to track. But I mean, measures of success and measures of effectiveness, they're industry specific and even more granular organization specific, right? Especially if you have a cultural element to your program, right? You're going to need help from your organizational stakeholders to then justify getting access to the data to even, kind of determine if it does make sense to track for effectiveness or success criteria.
The National Insider Threat Task Force set out in 2014 to do independent assessments of all the departments and agencies in the federal government that had to have an insider threat program. And they did that. They did an assessment of over 100 departments and agencies. We have started at the DITMAC in conducting assessments, not to measure compliance with the minimum standards, but to look at effectiveness and efficiency. And we have done 6 components so far, trying to expand the effort to get to all 47 DoD components. And again, I mentioned that they're all different. If you've seen one DoD component, then you've seen one DoD component, because the Defense Intelligence Agency is much different than the Defense Commissary Agency. So, there are programs, the ones that we've looked at right now, as a couple of examples. One program might have 8 personnel looking at user activity monitoring records. In a like-size organization, another organization has 3. So, it's a kind of a sliding scale. If 8 can do it, and we say they're highly effective, are they efficient if the other component is doing it with 3 and using a different methodology? So you might be highly effective, but inefficient. The largest insider threat program in the Department of Defense exceeds 100 plus people. The smallest program, insider threat program personnel, is half of a person who it's an additional duty for him. So, it's a very challenging balance between effectiveness and efficiency. And you can be compliant with the minimum standards and not very effective. And you can be not compliant with the minimum standards and have a highly effective program. So it's a tough problem set.
So this is what I heard from some very senior people. This is extremely difficult. So if you're out there listening and you're struggling with this, you shouldn't be discouraged. You've heard it directly from Eric and Mark. This is a challenge. Start simple. I like what you said, Mark, about tying it back to that mission set, the detect, the deter, the mitigate. And then Eric, as you were mentioning, where does the program want to go? What are the issues you're tackling? Who are your stakeholders that you're trying to connect with, and measure the success along those lines? And I think those are really good practical advice you shared. So thanks. Let's talk a little bit about maybe scope. Although many organizations are increasing their attention on insiders with malicious intent, many organizations are also are not focusing enough on policies, training tools, and tracking of the increasing risk with a non-malicious intent, especially negligent insiders, or maybe those that are breaking rules, but for a perceived good reason, or out of ignorance or lack of training and understanding. What are your thoughts on that? What's the right balance? What are some, guidelines and principles maybe that folks should be considering?
Eric, this is all you.
Okay, no, that's what I was waiting for you to say something. So are they focusing enough on non-malicious kind of versus your negligent, or are they focusing enough on non-malicious and negligent insiders? I would say in private sector, based on my experience, yes. And it's because these programs, I mean, they're a cost center, and you want to create value organically. So you're going to do as much as you can kind of with that program as possible. And that's going to bridge into things like assurance-based detections. Like, are you validating something from a compliance perspective? In a past life, we gained visibility to file shares that had effectively export control data on them, and we were trying to control for non-sovereign administration ultimately, compared to European Union and then the US. And we developed a process where the detections that we put in place were used to then justify and provide assurance to the regulatory body, like, hey, we can prove to you empirically that people are not accessing these files, and here's how. So that's an example that I've seen kind of in practice, where you're expanding, you're going beyond just your nation state actors, which I don't think they're going to go away, but it's focusing on, again, that big picture, and it's looking at risk through that holistic lens.
Yeah, and I would add that the same is true within government. I've never worked for private industry. I've spent my whole career in the military and working in the DoD. And one thing I learned a long time ago is that if I did all of the annual mandatory training I was supposed to do, I wouldn't do my job, that it would be a full-time job just to do and complete all of the training that's in policy that says I'm supposed to do training on. So we have to be creative in our training that we develop to make sure that it captures what we want to do. We've always used the term witting and unwitting insiders. I recently read a report where it described them as outsmarted. And in today's day and age, with the number of spear fishing, whale fishing, and all the other different types of exploitation that's occurring, we have to be creative to make sure the workforce understands that, like what you said, someone thinks they're doing something for the right reason, but it might be opening up a vulnerability to the network or something else through some sort of virus or something else that's been, when you clicked on something, the expertise of the people that are trying to get into either intellectual property or proprietary information within, or controlled unclassified information within any organization in the federal government. You just have to outsmart the people that are trying to outsmart you.
So this is a perfect opportunity to segue to some questions from our audience, and tied in right to this question. And this is a very good, thought-provoking question. So curious your guys' take on it. But employee productivity, is this an area where insider risk should be playing a part? Should this be something that we consider and or monitor for?
I can take that one. I would start by saying no. Employee productivity is not the place for insider risk management. And the information that we have access to, the analytics and data that we're aggregating, like, it can indicate whether or not somebody is or is not performing. But again, that's not the purpose of the program, right? You have people managers in place to manage those people. And if it's something like, hey, you have access to badging logs, can you tell me if they came in on time, right? I've gotten those questions as an analyst in a program and in the private sector, and honestly, I always would just forward them directly to labor and employment counsel. Like, hey, this might be an opportunity for you to interject and help them more effectively manage, or help me provide justification for why I can't do it. Right, because it's not, it's not ethical, and honestly, there's some privacy implications there as well.
Yeah, I would again also echo the privacy implications. Tools that are intended to be used to detect triggers or someone doing a specific thing wrong on the network should not be utilized to, it's not enough to prevent workplace violence. It's not enough to prevent data exfiltration, but if it's done at the detriment of privacy and civil liberties, then the programs will be fighting an uphill battle forever.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think it's a slippery slope, and you need to be very cognizant of what you're doing. Eric, I like your point. We have access to data, and if someone asks us a question, maybe the appropriate answer is refer them to the originator of that data and address their questions that way. You know, our analysis isn't necessarily looking at that scope. So I think that was a good point. Keeping on the questions from the audience, you know, we kind of kicked off with some of the questions and discussion, and we talked about stakeholder engagement. Can we unpack that a little bit? You know, who do we consider our stakeholders when we use term like stakeholder engagement? You know, what do we mean? What are some quick wins there?
So in insider risk programs, like the key stakeholders that we push forward, ultimately it's your HRs, your employee relations, it's legal, it's some measure of privacy, right? And then again, depending on the organization, it might be physical security. You might have an element from security operations center. If you're in manufacturing, you want somebody from the engineering function, right? Somebody that has an understanding of what you're trying to do. And then effectively they become, you know, as your core stakeholders, that's what's going to comprise your stakeholder hub. So that core kind of cross-functional governance forum where you talk about all the stuff that you want to do with your insider program, right? And that's a great way to very early on in the programs establish those clear expectations. Like, this is what we want to do, this is what we can do, and this is why we're not going to, right? And then they can help you ultimately help guide you to what you need to be doing organizationally. They can highlight greater risks. They can, again, point at areas of the business where more attention may be needed and could be supported by the insider risk program.
Yeah, I also think a key stakeholder is the employees, you know, who, you know, the program, again, if we want to get to a culture where people feel comfortable in bringing concerning behavior forward to management, that it's not a gotcha type situation. So one of the key stakeholders are the organization's employees. And if they understand what the program is there to protect people, protect facilities, information, and, you know, and also help other employees who are having a bad day.
I think it's fair to say that you're going to have different levels of engagement with different stakeholders. Some are going to be very involved, where you may share very close case details, and others are going to be more at a strategic level where you're talking about programmatic objectives and strategy. I see one of the follow-up questions is, you know, would you consider union representatives as part of a stakeholder engagement? And I think it's very dependent on the organization. If you've got a large union workforce, you certainly probably need to factor that in at some point and consider some level of engagement, although that's probably not going to be one of the innermost circle of trust, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's very organizational. I think you both said this. It's very organizational, dependent on your culture, on your alignment. But, you know, I have certainly found that the most success we've had in our program is when we have really developed those partnerships and really been inclusive of some very key persons.
Yep.
Another great question, and we're just about out of time, so this might be the last one. What are you considering up front as you decide if technology is the right solution? Obviously, that can go a lot of different ways, but, you know, what are some thoughts there? What are some maybe key principles that programs should keep in mind when evaluating technology?
Again, what is your outcome? Like, what is the output of the exercise? What are you trying to get out of it, right? You don't want to buy a Cadillac or a Ferrari analytical system if you're going to do more heavily, you know, kind of face-to-face stakeholder reach out, right? And again, I think also program size, to Mark's earlier point, right? He's got data scientists, he has behavioral scientists. It depends on the makeup of the organization. But I think if you're looking at technology, and I'll just, since we haven't mentioned UEBA, the types of detections that user and entity behavioral analytics platforms provide, right? It's anomalous activity compared to a number of different things, right? And that's how we find those kind of core anomalies. So those are the conversations that you want to take into those initial meetings, right? As you're spinning up the program, like, this is the type of functionality we need. This is what we could do with this, and kind of bring that into the organization's context. Yeah.
What I always like to try and convey is that insider threat, it's not new. You know, we in the Department of Defense have some going back to the 1780s. So it's not a new problem. It's a information sharing problem. Someone knows something and they haven't shared it with the right people. So all of the case studies, all of the events that have occurred that generated or built the need for an executive order to have an insider threat program, are, you know, all of the case studies that we've looked at, it's always about somebody knew something and they didn't share it with the right person. So when it comes to these systems, it can be as simple as, you know, the group coming together. I always feel obligated to share that before I went to the DITMAC, I was the Deputy Inspector General of our agency. And I was an impediment to information sharing because I did not think that it was my role to go and share anytime someone made an allegation of wrongdoing against somebody. And we always said, we'll know it when we see it. But it really requires a conversation and a dialogue between the insider threat program and these stakeholders, pillars, hubs, whatever the organization wants to call them, and define when do you come forward with information, when do you run, not walk, to bring the information to this centralized hub where you share information, and it needs to be a push, not a pull. So, you know, the programs that have really broken the code, in my opinion, are the ones that have clearly defined the criteria that they want the stakeholders and the employees in the organization. What do you want to share? And when is it wake me up in the middle of the night? When can it wait till Monday morning?
Yeah, I think those answers are great and reflect like a very good pragmatic approach. I remember early on when we were, you know, briefing and pitching our own program, I had a slide with an easy button and said, there are no easy buttons. You'll be told, you know, oh, why don't you just do this? And that is just not the case. And I think, you know, you explained very well that, you know, these problems are centuries old. You know, we need a firm foundation on processes, procedures, and then from there, to Eric's point, you know, what is the problem you're trying to solve with technology? Do you really understand it? Do you really know what you want to get out of it? And that's going to inform, you know, what is the best technology. But I think we've collectively seen that things like UAM and UABA can certainly play a critical role and helpful role to a program. So we're right at time. I just, again, want to thank Mark and Eric for joining us today. The comments were fantastic. I think it was a great discussion. I appreciate everybody else joining, taking time out of your day to join us for this call, and look forward for future discussions and collaboration.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it.